Good morning and hello everyone in Dehradun. I'm sorry that I cannot be here with you today. I'm actually at Yale University where we are concluding our graduate course on TEEB, on the economics of ecosystems and biodiversity. And also I'm in the last few days of preparing proofs for my publishers for a new book called Corporation 2020. I'm delighted that the CBD has chosen Dehradun to hold this very important meeting. And I want to spend a few moments speaking with you on the theme of poverty and biodiversity. I think the first point for us to recognize is that of the billion people who are below the poverty line, 3/4 of them actually live in rural areas. So the issues that we are trying to address are to do with rural poverty, especially the poverty of poor farmers, of gatherers who live and depend on forests, and of coastal fisherfolk who depend on the sea for their survival and their daily needs. These poor do not see nature as a luxury by any means, and nature is not just a luxury for the rich, it is a necessity for the poor. The reason they gravitate towards natural environments and the reason they use nature is because it provides so many goods and services to them free. And they do not have the money, they do not have the wealth to purchase alternatives. So the connection between poverty, where it resides, and why it resides so close to biodiversity is deeply because of needs. It is not a question of greeds. And if biodiversity is destroyed, if forests are destroyed or wetlands lost, it's usually not being driven by some form of cussedness or stupidity on the part of the poor. If it is driven by the poor, it's driven by them meeting their needs. And that's the first thing that we need to recognize. Nature is a kind of safety net for the poor. It's about meeting the needs of food, but also of livelihood, and it's about security. When we talk about food, globally, a lot of the bushmeat that is provided to the poor communities who live in or near forests tends to be the main source of animal protein, so it is actually essential for their health and their diet. Likewise, we know that almost 1 billion people around the developing world draw their main source of animal protein from fish. So therefore, coastal fisheries and artisanal fisheries are very much essential to the dietary needs of the poor. Now, these are not just the communities themselves who fish for their own consumption, but also for the villages and the town markets behind. And therefore, the whole network of food gathering, in fact, does have a commercial and a livelihood purpose as well. And these livelihoods are part of the household incomes of the poor. Secondly, nature provides the environs within which small-scale or subsistence agriculture can survive, because nutrients and fresh water, which come and are gathered together by forest ecosystems and are absorbed into the soil and into rivers and aquifers, eventually reach the fields of poor farmers. And these nutrients and freshwater inputs are vital because the alternative, which is constructed irrigation or which is pesticides and fertilizers, obviously cost money and they're expensive, and whether it is private wealth used for their provision or whether it is public works that are deployed, the reality is that it is about financing. Very often, and this is partly the misapprehension that we are trying to address here, very often it is thought that there is a conflict or a trade-off between development on the one hand and environmental sustainability on the other. But the reality appears to be quite different. And very often people argue that ecosystem services, the value of nature to society that is delivered every year, is a small part of GDP. That point tends to miss the issue as to who the benefits are for and who derives the most benefit from them. If we look at ecosystem services such as flood prevention and drought control, or such as the provision of nutrients and fresh water from the forest to the fields of poor farmers, their loss, or the loss of the forests and the natural capital that provide them, would most directly impact not you and me who can go and buy our foods from the marketplace, from the shops, but will directly impact the poor farmer, because it is his fields that will be wiped out. It is his cattle that cannot go into the forests and collect and graze leaf litter. And finally, it is his wife, his family who cannot collect the fuel wood, which is essential for providing them their main means of cooking. And to this day, more than 40% do depend on fuel wood as the main cooking medium. So these inputs to the rural household, these inputs to the poor household become vital especially in India, where we did a calculation, and in Brazil and in Indonesia, we did calculations where we found that even though these ecosystem services were 10, 15, or 20% of GDP in terms of the missing flows from our national calculus, when we work out how much these services are in terms of the livelihood incomes of poor household, the answer is that they are more like 45% to 90%. So the real ratio that we should be looking at here is not ecosystem services as a fraction of GDP overall, because that includes all kinds of services such as banking and financial services and advertising and so on, which don't have any bearing to our discussion. We should be looking at ecosystem services consumed and used by poor households as a fraction of the GDP of the poor. And that brings me to the key point of metrics, because today economic performance, indeed economic performance in developing countries, is still too much determined by dependency on GDP growth as the single metric of success. GDP is an average. It tells us a story about overall value addition across the economy, and that overall value addition may have very little to do to the value addition that is essential to poor communities. So not only is the problem of an average, but there is also the problem of missing ecosystem services. Firstly, the problem of the average can be understood very simply. For example, if you have a family of 4 people crossing a river, a 6-foot-tall man, a 5-foot-tall woman, a 4-foot-tall boy, and a 3-foot-tall girl, the average height is 4.5 feet. Now, does that mean, because their average height is 4.5 feet, that they can cross a river which is 4 feet deep? Clearly not, because the children will drown. For the same reason, we cannot look at an average, because there is a tyranny in this average. That's one of the reasons why the use of pure GDP is not a good idea. Secondly, if we are looking at GDP, we have to look at the GDP not just which is visible, manufactured, and measured, but also the invisible, that which comes from nature. And once again, we are beset with this problem of the economic invisibility of nature, which is what TEEB has tried to address on a global scale, and where country projects are now embarking on addressing it at a local scale, including here in India. So the second problem of the economic invisibility of nature also is wrapped up with the concept of GDP. So for all these reasons, I think partly because of the importance of the social importance of addressing poverty and the reduction of poverty as a key goal, as a policy goal, partly because of the fact that GDP is just an average, and if you really want to focus on development and wealth, you can't only look at an average, and partly because this average itself excludes a large number of invisibles, which are essentially important for poor communities and poor families. I think we need to relook at metrics. So the connection between poverty on the one hand, biodiversity and nature on the other, and the importance of looking at metrics is in fact a very important connection, and which is why I'm delighted that many countries are going forward with some of TEEB's recommendations, which is to look at accounting metrics at the national level. National accounts ignore a lot of these factors, and I think it is important for us to include natural capital in national accounts and to treat that as a priority, because using national accounts which do not include natural capital in fact accentuates some of the problems and the attitudes that we have inherited from the past. I think we have to step back for a moment and also worry about the next stage, as in if we can provide to the poor communities who depend on nature the basic means of survival. In other words, the benefits of ecosystems to just live from day to day. We have to ask also, what can ecosystems do for them in terms of employment? What can ecosystems do for them in terms of rights and abilities? And once again, we find that the answers are strong. Because where we have, for example, in Brazil, gatherers of, for the sake of argument, acai fruit, collectively earning only 3% of the total value of the acai fruit that is sold in the shops a short distance away in New York, is actually paid across to the gatherers and to the farming communities and to the cooperatives in Brazil. What that tells you is not that this is a bad thing, but it tells you that there is opportunity in terms of doing more of the value addition on the ground in Brazil. That's what it tells you. And the same logic applies almost everywhere. There are livelihood opportunities which have to be taken. There are success stories. For example, in Uganda, the fact that organic agriculture is so successful, more than 200,000 certified organic farms, And they are now looking at how they can do not just the growing of vegetables to be sold in European supermarkets, but also the packaging and the canning of vegetables in order to be sold in European supermarkets. So they're looking at the next stage of value addition, which of course is an employment opportunity. So whether we are talking about Brazil, Uganda, or India, there are employment opportunities in looking at how natural produce can be taken to the next stage by providing employment to the local communities close to where it was grown. Employment also comes, and this is particularly true in India, if we look at the management of protected areas. Globally, there are very few people managing protected areas. The total number managing what is effectively something like 12% of the surface on Earth are less than 1 million, according to the best estimates, and about 500,000 according to some. This is tiny if you compare to the number of people which are, for example, manufacturing cars, that's over 6 million, or manufacturing steel, that's over 5 million, or writing computer software, including here in India, that's over 5 million as well. So just imagine, and these are industries where the total capital is of the order of 1 to 2 trillion. Globally, natural capital is upwards of $100 trillion. To manage that much natural capital around the world, how many foresters do we have? How many people do we have in protected areas? Very few, far too few. And here again is an employment opportunity. If we give natural capital the same status as we give physical capital and manufactured capital, which I believe we should, because it generates wealth, it addresses poverty, and it provides employment, then one of the employments that we have to think about is adequately staffing the management teams around these protected areas, whether they are members of the Forest Service in India, or the Ministry of Environment and Forests in whatever country, or whether they are delegated employees working together with the government in order to better manage and conserve protected areas. So we need to look at that aspect of conservation and its employment driver as well. And finally, we need to look at some of the research and discovery that goes around natural protected areas and natural areas. Bioprospecting today is an issue which still bothers us from an equity perspective, and it does become very important for the CBD to look at access and benefit sharing, as indeed it has been doing for the last decade. But part of the reason why this happens is that we haven't worked out the mechanics of employment and of tasking and controlling and managing these processes so that the right amount of income is provided at the right level. If we just allow free markets to operate, we will get what we get, which is that there is an asymmetry between the power level and the contracts that are written from those who are the most powerful in a free marketplace to those who are at the next stage, to the next stage, right down to the lowest stage, which is the tribal in the village. There will be a total asymmetry in the exchanges, in the economic exchanges that are happening at each level. And the bottom of this series of exchanges will obviously suffer the most from the economic inequity. And that is part of the challenge of restructuring access and benefit sharing. How do you ensure that purely the forces of markets and the asymmetry of exchanges that takes place in free market conditions is addressed, and that the principle of equity can be brought in? So I think these are some of the aspects as well which have to be looked at when we talk about poverty and the improvement of livelihoods and the use of natural capital in order to do so. Ladies and gentlemen, I would have loved to be with you in Dehradun, which is a city that I have visited many, many times, sometimes stayed, sometimes just on my way to Mussoorie. I would have loved to share the audience and the enjoyment and the discussion with you, but I cannot. There are needs which hold me back here at Yale. But I wish you all the best and a very fruitful discussion today. Poverty and biodiversity is a link and a topic which has had much researched and much thought through already. But I think what is missing here in this space is the economic quantification of the challenge. And what is missing is the national accounting reflection of some of these issues that I have talked about. So I think with understanding the economics that links this issue and recognizing the need to also start reflecting this in accounting systems, both at the national level, at the regional and the local level, I think there is the way forward. I wish you all the best. Thank you.